of what we've been working on the Jenner Headlands Preserve. And, you know, even before we acquired the Jenner Headlands Preserve, we had a volunteer crew from CMPS that came out with us and helped us develop the first plant species list for the property. So we've definitely had a good partnership with CMPS for a very long time. And we also have several guided hikes every spring with CMPS. We try to get Peter Warner out to lead those. And we go out through a hike through our Serpentine wildflower field. So if you guys haven't been on any of those hikes, please sign up in the spring. And it's really an exceptional wildflower display. Usually the end of April going into the month of May is the prime time. So thank you so much for having me. I'm going to now attempt to switch over to share my screen here. Let's see. Make sure I can do this. Bear with me for a second here. See, that doesn't work for me. Okay, I think that is working now. Let's see here. Start the slideshow. I have two screens, so bear with me for a second.
We can see your Jenner Headlands slide without and just a picture of you on the side, so it looks good for on my end.
Oh, this is fine.
Great. So you can just see the main first slide, Jenner Headlands Preserve.
Yep.
Great. Let me manage my screens here. Give me 1 second. Okay. All right. Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. I'm going to give you a brief summary of what we've been working on the Jenner Headlands Preserve. Most of you are probably familiar with the Jenner Headlands Preserve, but this will give you a summary of some of the major natural resource initiatives that we've planned and implemented out on the Jenner Headlands Preserve. If you guys have any questions along the way, please let me know, or you can type it in the chat. And of course, at the end of the presentation, I can also answer questions as well. Let me get my laser pointer here. Great. All right. So the Jenner Headlands Preserve was purchased back in 2009. And we had a large portfolio of partners that helped us acquire this property. It was $36 million, and it took a huge partnership to make sure that we could acquire this and really preserve this gem along the Sonoma coast. Our partners along the way, of course, was the Open Space District, the State Coastal Conservancy, Wildlife Conservation Board, NOAA, U.S. Forest Service, and also the Moore Foundation, very helpful in providing us some seed money to get this whole initiation going, and then also money for the acquisition and also the stewardship of the preserve. So it really takes a whole team to be able to preserve a spectacular piece of the coast like this. And thank God it did. It came together December of 2009. We were able to purchase this property in perpetuity. You guys might not know all that much about the Wildlands Conservancy, but we are a statewide nonprofit public benefit organization, and our mission is to preserve the beauty and biodiversity of the earth and to provide programs so that children may know the wonder and joy of nature. So the education component is really a strong part of our mission. We are California's largest nonprofit landowner. We have preserves all the way from San Diego to Humboldt. We protect and care for over 150,000 acres of land. And what we do on these preserves primarily is restore these landscapes steward the resources, build visitor centers to welcome the public back to these landscapes to recreate, and provide free outdoor education programs so that our youth are taught the incredible importance of these natural open landscapes. For the Jenner Headlands Preserve, shortly after acquisition in 2009, we got to work on developing an integrated resource management plan for the preserve. And the main components looked at coastal prairie management, forest and stream management, and recreational use of the property. And for us to develop those ecological goals and get some guiding recommendations, the best management methods that we could apply to these landscapes to be good stewards of the natural resources, we put together technical advisors in each one of these areas or these habitats. And those advisors helped us develop these overarching goals and guiding principles. They helped us develop the recommendations for management. And then, of course, they also peer-reviewed our technical documents that we developed through the Integrated Resource Management Plan. So these advisors came from Sonoma State University, Resource Conservation Districts, UC Cooperative Extension. A lot of our partners also had folks at these technical advisory committees. And so this was a great way to really bring together knowledge from a diverse population of experts in the field, develop these overarching goals, and then implement it out on the landscape. So I'll be covering each one of these three topics here that you see at the very top here. The first one is coastal prairie management. The ecological goal that was developed through our technical advisors was to manage the coastal prairie habitat, support a high level of native biological diversity, habitat structure, and ecosystem function. As you probably know, coastal prairies, we've lost about 90% of our coastal prairies in California. So this is a very sensitive habitat type, and we wanted to make sure that we were managing this according to the best ecological principles that we know at the time. Looking at coastal prairie management history, it's important to understand the past management of these different ecosystems so that we understand where we are now and how we're going to move forward in the future. Over 8,000 years of grassland management by Native Americans using fire, burning these grasslands every 3 to 5 years, keeping these grasslands open and verdant with new growth, and then of course grazing by native animals. That of course has changed greatly, that past management, and our current conditions that we find out on the Jenner Headlands are primarily grasslands dominated by non-native invasive grass species and herbs. And the picture here is of velvet grass. Up at the top here is the inflorescences, and then here is a field of velvet grass really taking over part of a coastal prairie. In particular, this grass can really form thick, dense thatch and smother out a lot of other plants, lowering plant diversity. So looking at velvet grass, how it can take over if it's not managed, if the coastal prairies aren't managed, is kind of a good example that we use often out on the landscape. So these plants can outcompete native plants, build up thatch, lower plant diversity, and if they're not managed at all to be kept as open grasslands, they can also convert over to shrubland and also increase the fuel load on these coastal prairie habitats. So looking at the past history of management of this habitat, and then what our technical advisors recommended to manage really 1,400 acres of coastal prairie out here on the western grasslands, was to develop a well-managed livestock grazing system. So this is a rotational grazing system that was developed for the Jenner Headlands, controls the growth of non-native grasses, can keep those in check, and can also help control coyote brush and shrub encroachment into the grasslands, we want to keep these as open grasslands so that the diversity of wildlife can continue to complete their life cycle out here, out on the coastal prairie grasslands. And then also an important component, especially in light of the catastrophic fires that we've seen recently, is by doing rotational grazing, it can help reduce fire hazard by controlling the amount of grass and shrubs and the buildup of the thatch. Of course, there's a lot of caveats for using cattle. One of them is to prevent them from going into the stream corridors, overgrazing, things of that nature. So what we've done out on the Jenner Headlands on our coastal prairies is we've divided the coastal prairie into about 8 different fields. We keep the herd in one field, and then we rotate the cattle through the different fields. So we're able to observe the grazing that we're applying out there on the coastal prairie. And then when we've enough of the forage has been reduced, we'll move them to the next field. And then that field that they were just in has time to regenerate, recuperate. And so in that way, we're actually creating a mosaic of different grass structure throughout the coastal prairie grasslands. And let me see if there's any questions on the chat. I don't think I'm able to see the chat right now. So if you guys have any questions, just please go ahead and ask them. Otherwise, I'll just keep moving on. Well-managed livestock grazing out on the coastal prairies. And we've kept the cattle out of the forested areas, out of the riparian systems, whereas before, when this area was grazed, they were able to go into the forested areas and down into that riparian system and impair the water quality down there.
True.
So moving on to forest management, the forests of the Jenner Headlands really have gone through a huge human alteration, and we've lost about 97% of our old growth redwood forests. And so the ecological goals that were developed by our technical advisory committee was to restore these forests to a mature, complex, native coastal redwood, Doug fir, and oak woodland ecosystem, and then to protect and restore the plant and animal communities along the streams, an important component. And so looking back at the history of our forested ecosystem, again, thousands and thousands of years of Native American management using fire, prescribed fire, again, to help remove some of that woody material, to clear out and open up some of these forest ecosystems. After the fire, you have regrowth of a lot of different plants, good forage for the different ungulates that they might be hunting out there, but then also basketry materials and food materials as well. And then, as you know, over the last 150 years, we've had commercial harvesting of the redwood timber and Doug fir and tan oak out here on the Jenner Headlands. The land use history really is similar along the whole Sonoma coast all the way up to Humboldt of really devastating clear cuts and harvesting of our forest ecosystem, which has altered that forest ecosystem greatly. This is a pair of photos. The one on the left side is an aerial photo, a section of the Jenner Headlands back in 1947. This is actually a tributary right here to the East Branch of Russian Gulch. And what we can see in this photo is that there are some large redwood trees casting shadow on adjacent trees. This probably had been lightly harvested since the late 1800s, but it was a forest ecosystem that was probably fairly intact. And then in 1960, here is the comparison photo, the same exact area in 1960. And we can see that this aerial photo has captured the clear cutting of this forest ecosystem out on the Jenner Headlands. And so all of these white network of lines and spaghetti really is all roads and skid trails and haul trails. This forest is being clear-cut and is really being liquidated and being greatly altered compared to pre-settlement times. And so the forest ecosystem out that we're dealing with has really been greatly altered compared to a mature or an old growth forest ecosystem. We don't have any old growth forests left on the Jenner Headlands. There's a few old growth trees here and there, but primarily we're dealing with a very young redwood forest out here. And so the way that we are looking at managing this is to try to develop a mature forest ecosystem through the process of restoration forestry and the concept of thin and release. So if we look over here on the left-hand side, we have this young, dense stand of redwood trees where maybe there was one mother tree that was cut down. And so then instead of one tree, now we have 8 or 10 trees in that same area. In this photo, you can see that at one time there was actual sunlight coming down on the lower branches of these trees. But as these trees have grown up and they've crowded each other out, a lot of these branches have lost their needles because it's no longer getting any sunlight. So these trees are actually showing a kind of a stunted stage where only the upper canopy is alive. And then also you can see that in this forest ecosystem, there's so much shade on the forest floor that there really isn't much herbaceous cover of herbs and other brush underneath in this understory. So a very crowded, dense stand. And what we're trying to do is go in and thin out the smaller trees and leave the biggest and best trees so that those can then develop into this mature forest ecosystem. And so the concept is you thin out the smaller trees primarily, and that will release the growth of the trees that you leave in that landscape. And so studies have shown that if you can go into these redwood forests, these young stands with many, many trees per acre, pre-settlement times you had maybe 50 to 80 trees per acre, and now we have hundreds and thousands of trees per acre. So if we can go in there every 20 years or so and thin out those forest stands, redwood trees in particular have shown an incredible response to that thin and release method. They can grow up to 4 times as fast in these thin and release plots. And where they've done studies of understudy shrubs in these thin plots, within 30 years of this thin and release method, they've seen understory shrubs very similar to the old growth stands. They've also seen a bird response. Again, 30 years after doing this thin and release method, the birds in the understory are similar to what they find in these old growth forests. So what we're trying to do is move these towards that mature forest ecosystem in a way that will provide ideal habitat for those species that need those mature forest ecosystems to survive. And we're following a restoration forestry method in that we think it's going to take us about 100 years, maybe 150 years to reach our goals. But once we have reached our goals, we will pull back and we will not be thinning out the forest as heavy as we would initially. And so in order to know when we've reached our goal, what we've done is looked at some reference conditions and looked at tree distribution of diameter at breast height. So this chart kind of shows you this current condition of crowded trees, our reference condition that we're trying to move towards, and the color of these lines are really, tied to these different reference photos. And so in this chart, we have basal area on the y-axis by diameter at breast height in inches along the x-axis. And so what this is showing us is that These trees right here are fairly small trees in terms of diameter, and currently we have a lot of those trees in our forested ecosystem. If we look at our reference condition, we actually have a very large spectrum of age structure all the way up to 80 inches in diameter. You're starting to get into some very, very large redwood trees. And so what we will be doing is, as we go in and we thin and release the forest, we'll go back in and do monitoring, vegetation monitoring at the veg plots. And what we want to see over time is that this red line starts to be stretched out. We start to have larger trees, and that this red line current condition starts to resemble our reference condition or our mature forest ecosystem. Once our current condition starts to resemble that reference condition or mature forest ecosystem, at that point, then we'll pull back on our management methods. And so this is that restoration forestry where we have a time horizon and we have a goal that we're trying to achieve, as opposed to more of a sustainable harvest type method where the forests are going to be continually harvested for long periods of time. So this is a restoration forestry method that we're managing our forests with. The other important component of forest management is also dealing with wildfire fuel reduction. You know, nothing has really brought this to the fore more than the catastrophic wildfires that we see every summer and fall. And so we have been working on wildfire fuel reduction. We started back in 2013 to put in a network of shaded fuel breaks through the property. And so the idea of these shaded fuel breaks is to strategically locate these along ridge lines that has an existing road system. And what you want to do is reduce fuel loads about 150 feet on either side of these ridgetop roads. You want to keep the largest healthy trees. So this kind of resembles that restoration forestry management method. We're still keeping trees. We're not going up there and reducing all of that fuel. We still want some trees to provide shade and habitat for wildlife species. We remove the ladder fuels, so those are all the dead branches that can be ladder fuel and bring a ground fire up into the upper canopy. And once that occurs, you usually have really high heat and stand replacing type fires. So trying to get rid of those ladder fuels. And then also removing the smaller trees out there. And so this is how we've gone forward and created shaded fuel breaks throughout the property. We have about 130 acres that we've put in of shaded fuel break. And then also we, of course, remove the ground fuel as much as possible. So what does that look like out on the landscape? This is a representative photo of our East Ridge shaded fuel break before. Up there on the East Ridge, we put in some veg plots and we had about 1,800 trees per acre. It was just a dog hair thicket up there. It was really hard to tell even what type of trees we had. It was just so thick with vegetation. So we went in there with hand crews, with masticators, different management methods, and we thinned out the forest. And over here on the right side is that after photo. So you can see that we still have many trees per acre, but we've really drastically thinned this plot out. And we've left the biggest and best trees, even though these trees aren't huge trees, this is what we had to work with. And so we went in, thinned out these plots. And the stems we reduced from about 1,800 trees per acre to about 400 trees per acre. So we removed the stems per acre, about 80% of that we've removed, but the basal area we only reduced it by about 30% because we left the biggest and best trees. And the idea is we want those trees to grow up, have nice broad crowns, be able to shade that understory to keep cooler conditions, but then also hopefully inhibit any regrowth of trees in that area. And then these areas need to be maintained through mechanical methods, but then also we've been using fire out there as well. We've partnered with CAL FIRE, and they were able to develop a vegetation management plan for the property, or a prescribed burn plan is really what it is. And so they've been able to go back into these areas where we've reduced the fuel load, removed those ladder fuels, thinned out those plots, and then they burn the understory. So the concept is to apply prescribed fire to these ground fuels, further reduce that fuel load, because after you go in and you create this shaded fuel break, there's still a lot of material on the floor of the forest. Hopefully it decomposes over time, but some of these plots are so thick that it is really beneficial to bring in fire to reduce these ground fuels even further, and then also knock back any resprouting hardwoods or shrubs to maintain that fuel load, maintain that fuel break. And to date, we've applied prescribed fire to about 40 to 50 acres of our shaded fuel break ecosystem out there, or network, I should say. So we continue to work on this. We've also been partnering with the Good Fire Alliance, with a prescribed fire volunteer program in Sonoma County. And so hopefully we will be able to apply prescribed fire more widespread throughout the county to help reduce fuel loads and reduce the catastrophic wildfires that we see every year. Moving into some of the work that we've done on stream restoration and protection. We've done some fish passage barrier removal in Russian Gulch, an area where a lot of old redwood stumps had been pushed down into the creek. During the clear-cut days, they actually formed a number of dams in the creek and actually stopped fish from moving upstream in the system. And so we went in last fall and were able to remove these obstructions. And so we've opened up about 3 miles of spawning habitat on our east branch of Russian Gulch. And so that's important habitat for steelhead. And historically, we also had coho in that creek. But during the clear cuts and all the sediment that was washed into the creek, we've lost coho from that system. Hopefully with this restoration and these barrier removals, we can bring back the coho to this stream drainage. We've also done tire dump removal from Jenner Gulch. Some of the old school ways of doing erosion control is just basically dumping a lot of tires into the creek. Obviously that's a bad idea, and so we've gone in, removed those. As I've said before, we've put up riparian fencing to keep the cattle out of these drainages, especially those that are adjacent to the grasslands on the west side. We've reduced the erosion around water troughs by working on upgrading those systems. And then we've also done road upgrades, decommissioning, and erosion control work. As you probably know, road systems out in the forested and ranch landscape can actually provide a lot of fine sediment into the streams, and that lowers that water quality. It can smother those salmonid spawning grounds and really degrade the habitat out there. So example of some of the work that we've done in Sheep House Creek, which is actually a coho reintroduction site, is a Sheep House Creek sediment reduction program. Any obsolete roads that we no longer needed within that watershed was removed and decommissioned. So we've decommissioned about 1.87 miles of road in Sheep House Creek. On the main road that we do need for management activities, we've installed 13 new culverts, 77 rolling dips. We've outsloped about 1.3 miles of road. These are all different road shaping techniques that help keep that fine sediment from being dumped directly into those streams and drainages. And just on the Jenner Headlands, we've estimated that we've prevented about 8,500 cubic yards of fine sediment going into Sheep House Creek, which equates to about 850 dump truckloads. So doing some work on our roads, maintaining our roads, decommissioning those that we don't need, really can have a tremendous benefit to the stream's ecosystem and the salmon habitat out there. And hopefully you guys have made it out to the Jenner Headlands. We are open to the public. Back in September of 2018, we finished our parking lot, 34 spaces. It's about 1.5 miles north of the town of Jenner, on the east side of Highway 1. And so we're open 8 a.m. to sunset. We have about 14 miles of hiking trails, and that will take you through our coastal prairie grasslands, through our redwood forests that we're restoring, through some of our green gulches, East Branch Russian Gulch. And if you're really adventurous, you can actually hike all the way up to Pole Mountain, which is about a 16-mile round trip. So it is definitely a full day excursion, but the views from up there are just really incredible. So if you haven't made it out to the Jenner Headlands, please come out. Like I said, our spring wildfire season is end of April, and May is the peak. But of course, we're open all year, and 8 a.m. to sunset. And if you're interested in learning more, you can visit our Jenner Headlands Preserve iNaturalist Notebook, observations that we've seen of plants and animals and insects and everything. We try to use iNaturalist for that. Also, the Integrated Resource Management Plan that I spoke of earlier is on our website, the Wildlands Conservancy, and it's on the Jenner Headlands Preserve page. And you can actually download that Integrated Resource Management Plan. You can look at all the resources that we've inventoried. You can see how we developed our ecological goals and how we're implementing good, sound stewardship out on the landscape. And with that, that is the summary of the Jenner Headlands. We've done a lot out there, and there's still a lot to do. And it has been extremely rewarding to be able to you really take the whole planning effort, bring together such an incredible knowledge base of our advisors, and then implement this integrated resource management plan and see the results out on the landscape. So thank you so much, and I can take any questions that you might have.
Hi, Brooke. Thank you so much. What tons of good information, and we had some questions while you were speaking, so I think I will start in the chat box, and then we can open it up from there after that. So
Great.
First question in the chat box is, will cattle eat velvet grass?
They will eat velvet grass. They won't eat the inflorescence. They usually try to stay away from that. They will eat velvet grass. Of course, if you can use them in more of a targeted manner, they will go after velvet grass and some other grasses out there. But usually what they'll do is they'll eat the other grasses they prefer. As for that forage is reduced, then they'll finally get to velvet grass, especially if it doesn't have that inflorescence on it.
Great, thank you. The next one is also related to this, is how do you limit cattle food consumption to eat only now native plants?
That's impossible, of course. They're out there eating a wide variety of plants. You know, some of the European forage species, especially the Italian ryegrass, they really love that stuff. And we do have that widespread throughout the property, especially in our serpentine wildflower fields. So in some instances, they do prefer some of those forage species. But when we bring them into the field, they're going to eat what they prefer. We leave them long enough so then they start to eat some of our target species. And then as the forage is brought down to a certain level, we'll move them on to another field. So it's really kind of a balancing act of applying pressure to the grasslands out there, trying to keep those non-natives in check, but of course they eat a wide variety of grasses out there.
Thank you. Next question is, have you thought about bringing in elk?
We have thought about bringing in elk, and in fact, down at our Wind Wolves Preserve, we do have an introduced Thule elk herd. It's about 300 strong, but that preserve is massive. I think we have about 40,000 acres of grassland. So we have thought about that for the Jenner Headlands, but based on our experience over at Wind Wolves and doing the introduction there, there needs to be much larger expanse of grassland to support the Thule elk. And then also, we do have Highway 1 right on our western edge. So lots of cars going up and down that highway. And in order to keep the Thule elk on our side of the property, we would need some pretty large fences. But I think in time, the Thule elk have expanded their range. And I think I'm waiting for the day when we have Thule elk starting to wander on to the Jenner Headlands, and that will be a great day.
Sounds good. Next question is, are dogs allowed on trails?
Dogs are allowed on trails on leash and under owner control. Yes.
Thank you. Do you still have badgers out there, or are there badgers out there?
We do have badgers out here. We have a lot of badgers, in fact, and it seems like they are pretty happy and healthy out here in terms of the population. You can see a lot of badger sign from the burrows and the foraging out here on the headlands. I guess the other thing I want to mention that I guess I didn't in my talk was, only the kind of the western third of the preserve is open to public recreation. The rest of the preserve at this point is closed to public access. But we do see badger sign out here, and every once in a while we will see them during the day or at dusk.
Thank you. Next question let's see, it's about do you remove the materials that are cut by shaded fuel breaks that follow the prescribed burns?
No, we don't. What we do is when we go into these shaded fuel breaks and we're breaking down the fuel load and thinning things out, all of that is left on the forest floor. So in some instances where we can bring in heavy machinery, we use a masticator, which is basically able to reduce the trees and shrubs to kind of large chip type material. So it does a pretty good job of breaking the material down, creating lots of surface area where it can then start to decompose. In the steeper areas where we have to send in hand crews, it's lop and scatter. So they are trying to remove all the limbs off of the trees, break up the main trunk as much as they can, try to get that material within about 18 inches, 2 feet of ground level, with the idea that so the soil microbes will start to decompose that material. We have a lot of hardwood in our shaded fuel break. They don't decompose all that quickly. And so that prescribed fire that I was talking about is a really important management tool because after you've established your shaded fuel break a year or two, you can bring in that fire. And then, of course, that fire will burn all of that material that has dried on the ground, and it will knock back any resprouts. So I think the more that we can use prescribed fire in those situations, the better off we'll be in maintaining our shaded fuel breaks and reducing that fuel load that initially is quite high on the forest floor.
Thank you, Brooke. Just a heads up, we have a lot of questions going. They're actually really fun questions, so I'm excited to keep up. Are you okay to keep going?
Yeah.
All right, great. So next up is, will the pampas grass that burned in the last fire come back stronger, or what will it do?
That's a good question. The pampas grass that burned in the last fire, so I'm thinking that might be up on Myers Grade. I don't know. I really don't know the fire ecology behind pampas grass. I have seen it burn, and it seems to burn quite well. Even though it's green, it has a lot of dead thatch on it. We will wait and see. Most likely, it will probably If it's not too severe, that root mass will probably still be alive and it'll probably resprout, unfortunately. But we'll take a look at what happens up there on Myers Grade.
Okay, someone was looking at a PDF map and wondering where the serpentine area was.
So if you go to our website and you download the PDF trail map, there's going to be a wildflower loop that is on kind of the southern portion of the property. It's in the western grasslands. It's basically just upslope of the town of Jenner. That is the wildflower serpentine area that I've been talking about. And so that has that serpentine soil and of course has a lot of native plants, forbs and grasses we still find there. Off the serpentine area, we have about 95% non-natives. On the serpentine, we found about 50% of natives in that area. So that's where you'll find it.
Great, thank you. Next up, great work on the rows and reducing the sediment input. Curious how costly these repairs are.
They're very costly. And so for that one, we actually partnered with private landowners that were owned land lower in that watershed. We partnered together and the Resource Conservation District put in a grant to Department of Fish and Wildlife, California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And so we were able to get a restoration grant for that entire watershed. For our portion, I think that whole project was, I'm trying to remember, I think it was maybe $900,000. On our property, I think it was around $400,000. So very expensive. It took 2 years to implement the project on our property. And so usually what the agencies like to see is us partner with other landowners so that we can cover a whole watershed and reduce that fine sediment from the whole watershed and not do this piecemeal type of approach.
Thank you so much for sharing. Is there a native plant list for the wildflower loop?
We do have a native plant list. I don't think we have anything specific to the wildflower loop. We have put together a wildflower guide. I don't think we have that posted yet, but what I should do is I'll make a note of it and I will send at least the wildflower guide out to you guys so you can take a look at it and get ready for next spring.
Thank you, Brooke. Is it something that we could post, share on our website if we had I think we have a spot for plant lists.
Yeah, something that you could post to your, so I could send you the full plant list and then I can also send you the wildflower guide. It doesn't cover all of the wildflowers, but I think we have about, I'm guessing maybe 16 of the most prevalent wildflowers that you'd see out there.
Great, thank you. There was a couple questions that were messaged privately to you. Are you able to take a look at those as well?
Let's see here. I will take a look through the chat box. I see the message, but I don't, let's see. I think I do. Oh yeah. Yeah, I do see that. Yes. Let me copy those so I don't lose those. Yeah, so I can respond to those.
Okay, great. I think we have wrapped up the last of the questions in the chat box. Does anybody on the phone have questions? I want to give those who are calling in also an opportunity to ask questions. All right. Well, Brooke, thank you so much. There's so much great information. I learned a lot about the Jenner Headlands. I've been out there, but I didn't know all this work that had gone on, and really fantastic job taking action to manage the land in the right way. Thank you for sharing with us. We really appreciate it, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everything that CMPS does, all your volunteer work days and the work that you guys do. I keep close track of it, and I thank you for all your good work as well.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining.
All right.
Have a good evening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Leah.
Bye.
Bye.